library does inspiring, so it's really nice to be a part of that. Anyway, I wanted to ask Evan, just for starters, if you could take a few minutes, since the book is only out 2 weeks, to tell the audience what it's about, and what your thesis is.
Well, I just wanted to first say how we did move here recently, and how wonderful it is that there's a series like this and a library like this, and how grateful I am personally, but just to be part of a community that values conversations like this. And particularly excited I am that you're having this conversation with me. I've read the prize, I think, 2.2 times. I read it when it was first appeared in the New Yorker, and I read it when it came out, and I reread it about 4 months ago with a whole different perspective as a New Jersey resident, and it gave me all kinds of insight into New Jersey politics. And I think we're just in general terms interested in kind of the same things about what makes society work, or maybe where I told people makes society not work. My book is really a refutation of a story. There's a movie called From Homeless to Harvard, which you may have seen, and it's about a young woman who grows up in the worst imaginable circumstances and does manage to get her way to Harvard. And it is part of what Ivy plus colleges do. They do promote some mobility, some upward mobility for the poor, but that's dwarfed massively by opportunity that they provide for the rich. So my book actually began on a dinner bet with a friend of mine who was an enthusiastic alumni interviewer for Harvard. I was not such an enthusiastic alum of Harvard, and he touted Harvard's financial aid initiative, which means that anybody who comes from a family earning less than $65,000 a year goes for free. And I said, that's wonderful, but it begs the question, how many students come from families making less than $65,000 a year? And that was significantly over the American median income at the time. And I said, if it's anywhere close to half, I'll buy dinner. And it was nowhere near, it was about 17%. And we resolved that bet with data from the Harvard Crimson's survey of incoming freshmen, but it's subsequently been immeasurably enriched by a massive groundbreaking study, which is really an opportunity in America, by the economists Raj Chetty and John Friedman, who I interviewed in the book. And the picture that they show is that the lion's share, the overwhelming amount of upward mobility that colleges produce is from public colleges like CUNY, where I teach. 8 of the top 12 colleges that produce the most upward mobility are CUNY colleges, and that what elite colleges really excel at, and this is, I think, one of my contributions, is I reshuffled their data to look at it through a lens of downward mobility. Elite colleges are basically a complete insurance policy against significant downward mobility, and they're the near exclusive promoter of a certain top-end mobility, which would be familiar to anybody who's gone to one of these schools, which is if you want to work in investment banking at Goldman Sachs or McKinsey and management consulting, you have to go to one of these places. So I think that affluent whites understand this, and their standard life course is that they live in the city until they have kids, and then they either send their kids to private school or they move to an affluent suburb. And what they're seeking access to are the resources, and more specifically, the types of narratives that these colleges choose to value. Athletic prowess at niche sports like lacrosse or squash or fencing, and that this is a massive driver of economic segregation in America.
So I found the book really fascinating for many reasons. I think, one of the questions I had was, how do you prove causality? Like with the chicken or the egg, did the universities cause this segregation? Are there lots of forces combining to contribute to it? But as I read the book, I felt like I really don't care. We could argue that, but it seems like a minor point because it is such a portrait of the stacking of the deck against people who don't have economic resources. And, we've all seen this happen over time and get more extreme just in our our own lifetimes. So and sort of looking at the way you deconstruct the place of elite education in that. It is just such a shocking revelation to me. And I just wanted you, I wrote down a couple of things that, I remember when a lot of IVs started this program of anybody with $65,000 less of annual income would go for free. And I just assumed that could really diversify the class. And the data that you presented, I guess from Cheney and Friedman, but other sources too, it completely belies that. I mean, maybe you could probably pick out some better stats, but 70% of the Harvard class comes from the top income quintile. 3% comes from the lowest quintile. So in paying, to attract people with under $65,000, they're not going for the lowest quintile. They're probably going for people closer to $65,000. When you took it down to the 1%, like there are more students from the 1% than there are from the bottom 50%.
There are 38 colleges in the United States that have more students from the top 1% of the income distribution than the bottom 60%. And I think another way of looking at it is what does it mean to be poor, born poor or rich? So if you're born into a top 1%er family, you have a 40% chance of ending up at an elite college, like it's kind of the top 60 in the Barron's ranking, and about a 1 in 5 chance of ending up at an Ivy Plus school. And it's virtually certain that you'll go to a selective college. If you're born in the lowest income quintile, you have a less than 0.5% chance of ending up at elite college.
And you also just look at the way they spend their endowments and what they could be doing to spend it on, to attract and make a welcoming atmosphere for students in the lowest income ranges. But also what you have a lot of suggestions of what they could do with their endowments to make this situation look like this.
Right. I mean, it's very hard for people to have a sense of big numbers, right? Harvard's endowment is currently about $52 million a year. If they continue with their current rate of growth, they'll pass $1 trillion sometime in the early 22nd century. And basically all of these colleges spend down approximately 4.5% of their endowment every year. That figure doesn't come out of thin air as a federal requirement for nonprofits that they spend down a certain. Now, one way to look at this is what could Harvard or Yale or Princeton do if they increase the drawdown on their endowment by 1%? So with $50 billion a year, that would be an additional $500 million. Well, the Harvard, it costs about $200 million a year to run a college. So they can run 2 or 3 more colleges. Imagine Harvard, Detroit, just devoted to producing socioeconomic opportunity. And I just think this is an important thing to get on the table right away. These colleges are the beneficiaries of massive tax advantages. There's a sociologist at UC Merced. He calculates that collectively they're receiving about $20 billion in tax breaks every year. Contributions to endowments are tax deductible. Earnings on endowments are tax deductible, and virtually all of these colleges are exempt from local and state real estate taxes. So we, as taxpayers, are making a massive investment in these colleges, and it's fair to ask, what do we get in return? Well, the Cheney-Friedman data conclusively shows that we're not getting an engine of economic mobility. We're getting a massive engine of class calcification, and I'm sure we'll talk about this. To me, I might feel differently about it if Harvard and Yale and Stanford and Princeton were taking a bunch of rich kids and promoting them and shifting them into do-gooder careers. But that's not the case at all. About 60% of Harvard graduates go into investment banking, management consulting, finance or the tech sector. About 2% go into education, most of whom go to Teach for America. And by contrast, depending how you define public service, at my college, between 2/3 and 3/4 of people go into public service. So these are segregated schools in every sense of the word. They're the Ivy Plus colleges, the colleges of the rich. I have taught, my wife and I have taught at a college of the poor for about a quarter century. These colleges produce investment bankers and management consultants. And if you're walking the streets of New York and you talk to a cop or a firefighter or a teacher, ask them where they went to college, chances are they went to CUNY. By the way, both of my parents went to CUNY and both became teachers. My dad, they're here.
They're here tonight.
They are, but neither is an investment banker.
Also, while I was reading the book, the oral argument for the affirmative action case occurred, and I was listening to part of it, and I was really struck when Clarence Thomas made an argument completely consistent with Evan's book, because he was asking the lawyers for Harvard and the University of North Carolina, how you want to have a racial, you want to consider race in order to increase diversity, because diversity is such a value at your university. Why is it that about 80% of the students at Harvard are wealthy? Do you not value diversity of socioeconomic?
Well, their hypocrisy or contradiction is more extreme than that, and it has massive legal significance. So at Harvard, about 1/3 of students are an ALDC, child of they're either a recruited athlete, child of an alum, that's legacy, child of a donor, or child of a faculty member, that's the C. And they're overwhelmingly white, and recruited athletes at Harvard, 70% of them are white, 3% of them are from socioeconomically disadvantaged families. So you get a picture of what this is. These are massive multipliers of your chance of getting into college. You have about a 5% random shot, random super smart shot of getting into Harvard. For recruited athletes, it's about 80%. For legacies, it's about 35%. It's a massive multiplier. And it makes their position legally untenable, because under the law, under the Equal Protection Clause, a Equal Protection Clause requires race neutrality, and you can depart from that only for a compelling interest. And everybody feels that diversity is a compelling interest, but the intervention has to be narrowly tailored. Well, there's a race neutral way to achieve diversity, which is, and ALDC preferences or sharply curtail them. And then there's more opportunity available for the Asian plaintiffs and for socioeconomically disadvantaged students and students of color. And so Clarence Thomas is right to focus on that. And I argued in multiple places that the district court decision is wrong. And I understand affirmative action, race-based affirmative action in the United States is going to end. Certainly if the Supreme Court overturns Roe v. Wade. And there will be multiple villains in that story. Ed Blum, the professional litigant who's funded the Asian students lawsuit. There's no universe in which Ed Blum has any genuine concern about Asians or Asian Americans. But it is also Harvard's fault because of their indignant insistence on doing affirmative action for rich whites. They have put the issue before the Supreme Court when it need not have been.
I mean, have they done away with it, the legacies and the
or at least, Harvard convened 2 committees to discuss whether there was some race neutral way to achieve diversity, and each committee summarily concluded that it did not, even though it's clearly incorrect. But the district court judge who went to Middlebury and the University of Pennsylvania Law School said that ending legacy preference would affect important institutional interests. There is not a shred of evidence that legacy preference has anything to do with alumni generosity. And in fact, MIT has never practiced legacy preference, and they have a $25 billion endowment.
You know, Dave made the point that both you and I graduated from Harvard. And we had actually decided before you prompted us that this should be something we should talk about. We were gonna confess, and we were gonna even say, what do we think about that? So, and I had asked you when we chatted a little bit before this, knowing what you know now, would you do it? Or would you do it differently?
Right. It's an interesting confessional, right? We're open to the world.
That's our times. We're very confessional.
We're both Jewish, right?
We overshare.
Three baruchas, and I mean, I'm very glad that I was able to write this book, and I don't think I could have done this without having the peculiar life experiences that I've had. I mean, I've just spent my whole life kind of traversing different class boundaries, and because of my parents and their commitment to education and where we lived, I've just always been focused on how school shapes people's lives. And you literally asked me whether I would go again, so I'm glad that I could write this book. I knew when I went to college that I didn't fit in. I felt like an outcast in many regards, and I've interviewed lots and lots of people for the book, many students. In retrospect, I didn't understand it this way at the time. I understand it now as having been about class. So I joke in the book that I oozed middle class. I was a bowler in high school, very good bowler. But my roommates made fun of me for it, and nobody where I grew up did. But they just didn't see me or the world the same way that I did. And I think it's really important to put this on the table. I've taught at CUNY now for 23 years. I love my job. I'm excited to teach every day that I go into the classroom. About 60% of CUNY students come from families making less than $30,000 a year. And it simply is not possible. And I've found my way. I teach a lot of honor students. I teach super smart people, all of whom work at least part-time, nearly all of whom work full-time. And it's just not possible to see them work as hard as they do and be as successful as they are academically and just not be changed by the experience. So I'm very grateful that I've had all of those pictures, that I've seen, both sides of the tracks. Did I like it? I don't know. Can't change the past. So it's one of those things. I guess I'm glad it's over. Would you have gone again?
As you said, I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama. And I was, I was a token. I was one of the only people from the Deep South there at all. And the others had gone to Exeter or Andover, and I had gone to public school in Birmingham. I was extremely unprepared socially and academically. Schools were nothing compared to the schools. It changed my life. I made incredible friends who remain friends. And I have to admit, I'm sure it helped my career. I'm sure that it was, I got an interview at the Washington Post probably because I started from my resume. And I remember one of the first things when I interviewed with Ben Bradley, that was back in the day, and he said, "Oh, I see you went to Harvard. We love you." And so I said, "Well, but I don't think that's the most important thing about me." And so he said, "Oh, what should I be looking at on this resume?" And I had gone to newspaper, and at the time I interviewed with him, I was working at the Atlanta Journal Constitution. So I said, "Well, I think it's interesting about me that I grew up in Alabama and I went to Harvard, but I went back and I went to work at a newspaper in my own state." I think that's that's an interesting thing. And so, anyway, he said, oh, okay, well, that's your right. Anyway, years later, a friend from the Atlanta papers came and interviewed with him, and he mentioned that she knew me. He said, oh, Dale is great. I love Dale. We have just way too many people from Harvard. And so my friend said, but Dale went to Harvard. She's from Birmingham. But anyway, it was just like, I know that was the reason that he interviewed.
Well, one of the things I would take from your story, I read hundreds of books about education, and of course, I'm writing my own book. And my favorite is a book called Pedigree by a sociologist named Lauren Rivera, who embedded herself at a management consulting firm. And it's about hiring elite law firms, investment banks, and management consultants. So the story that you just told is entirely consistent with the story that she tells, which is elite organizations. And of course, you were joining, a real opinion leader, right? It's an elite organization in kind of the most important sense. Informs people. Is it's all driven by credential fetishism, which is part of why it's so important to talk about who gets access to those credentials. And what's especially depressing about our story, and I think you were spared this because you actually wanted to do something in the public interest as opposed to maximize the return on your degree, is that when they choose among Harvard and Yale and Stanford students, what interviewers look for is not just where they went to school, but they're looking for playmates. And so they're looking for lacrosse players or drinking buddies. And this signal comes through loud and clear in the data. So I'm sure it'd be interesting if you had tried to get yourself a job at Goldman Sachs to know how that story turned out.
True.
Well, we'll never know. I'm glad you became a reporter of this thing.
Right. Well, another thing, you in the book, Evan quotes frequently a book by a writer named Paul Tough, who has written a tremendous amount about educational inequity. And I wonder if you could talk about, one thing that he focused on is the University of Texas, where, they now, because Texas did away with racial considerations at all. And they I guess it was when Bush was governor, that they went to a program when the top 10% of every high school was automatically admitted to the University of Texas system.
So there was a lawsuit. There was a similar challenge to this lawsuit, and the Supreme Court would have ended race-based affirmative action had Antonin Scalia not died. They were forced to respond to an adverse ruling from the district court, and they suspended race-based programs, and they instituted the top 10% rule. So they admitted about 3/4 of their class, basically by virtue of high school class rank, and it had enormously positive benefits, both in terms of race and socioeconomic diversity. And it's important to put this on the table. High school class rank is a far better predictor of college performance than SAT or ACT scores, which are notoriously poor predictor of college performance, but are highly, almost perfectly correlated as well.
One of the things that I'm sure you focused on this when you read it, was he looked at the University of Texas what it takes to help the kids who come from the poorest high schools with the lowest amount of resources. In other words, like they're not prepared academically to get them not only academically prepared but also just socially prepared. They've never been around. They're the first in their community or family to go to college. They don't even, they don't have that experience of being in the classroom and learning how to manage your time, all of the things that you have to do in order to succeed. And they have an immense tutoring program there. And it's often, I think that primarily the students who do the tutoring are students who come from the lowest quintile, who have succeeded. And it's so crucial that those are the tutors as opposed to somebody from the top quintile. And they put so much into it. It makes you realize that if other if the elite colleges were going to diversify more, they have to do a lot more.
For sure. I mean, my wife's a sociologist. She's also here, and a sociologist named Peter. He has a concept called habitus, which is a way of being, right? And a lot of what you learn when you go to college, what you're supposed to learn to college is a way of acting, it's comportment, it's speech. My mother always said that I had a very thick Brooklyn accent. Well, she would say positively. She said you came back and you had a neutral accent. It's true, because what I really did, which I only understand in retrospect, is I stopped talking like a middle class person and I learned the affectation of the upper class. And it's why I'm sitting here in a suit, which isn't the most expensive suit, the most expensive suit I can afford. But that's what you learn, and you see massive deficits. I teach, right? I mean, part of what and I, over time, types of students are really aspirational gravitate. It's the person who really wants to get to a good law school, or they want to go to a different type of graduate school or whatever. And I love that type of mentoring. But part of it is, well, I've read the New York Times every day for 37 years. My dad used to bring the Science Times home to me because he knew I liked it on Tuesdays. And part of what it is why did I read Prize in the course of my ordinary life, not knowing you, not because I had any personal interest in it, but just because it was part of what I was trafficked in. And that is just sort of a way of being. It's a way of existing within a class structure. It's very, very hard to do. It's not something that elite colleges take particularly seriously. And in fact, it's part of why it's so hard to be a poor kid in one of these
colleges. I just thought of something kind of funny, a personal story was that I had a very heavy Southern accent when I went to college. And again, there was nobody else who had one. And I started noticing that if I answered a question in class, if I was sitting in the back of the room, everyone turned around and stared. And it wasn't because I was brilliant, it's because it's so bizarre to them. And people at different points came to my room and said, I heard there's someone from Alabama. And I said, yes. So I stopped talking. I just couldn't stand it. I had nightmares, about being.
That is, sorry, in some sense, the experience of every woman and every person of color who goes to one of these places, which is they feel shame and they don't feel like they have the same right to speak as everybody else. And that is in part because there's not a critical mass of those people. I didn't ask you this, but I'm going to guess that core friendship group you have from college is overwhelmingly women.
Oh, it's, yeah.
Yeah, and that's because you would have gravitated to people. I mean, imagine what it was like. So you're there at a transition stage, right? Where women, what percentage of the Harvard Radcliffe students were women at that point?
Oh, there were, it was 4-to-1 and
20. So you're like first Black students who walk into a high school in Little Rock, Arkansas. Not quite, but 5 years earlier, it would have been. I mean, you're pioneers. Regard as completely equal citizens, and it's a very, very hard position to put an 18-year-old.
Yeah. No, it is. I mean, there's no comparison between being a white person and
For sure.
But I think that's what you mean. I got all those.
For degrees of suffering.
I wanted to switch back to another thought that you brought out in the book, which was stunning, which is that, even kids who get full rides to colleges, who come with basically no family money to speak of, don't have their basic expenses paid for. They don't have their books, they don't have their food. And the degree of food insecurity on these campuses it really shocked me. I mean, I just wanted to read some of the numbers. You can probably spout them off yourself, but in the study that was done by a professor who's done a lot of work on this subject, she did a survey of community college students. There were 4,000 students, 40% of them were skipping meals and going hungry because they couldn't afford their food. 39% of CUNY students, 40% of students on the University of California campuses, 59% of students at Western Oregon University, and Cornell, 22% of students skip meals. I think Dartmouth of the students on financial aid, 76% of them go hungry during the student breaks, the semester breaks when people aren't in school. And what was a Middlebury, 10% are sometimes or often skipping meals because they can't afford it. And I mean, it's just it's amazing that you know that you can see why people wouldn't go to these schools even at full ride because they can't live. And even homelessness. I don't think I have the numbers, but there are students who are frequently or periodically homeless.
One thing I think is you probably it'll be intuitive when I say it to you, but you probably haven't thought about it. Is the cost of going to college, the cost of sending your child to college isn't just $85,000 a year, which is bad enough. It's $85,000 a year plus the opportunity cost of them not working. So of course, I'm guessing there's nobody in this room who would have their kid take a year off and work a minimum wage job at Wendy's. But if you were struggling to make ends meet, that $20,000 or $24,000 that they might bring home by working a minimum wage job could be the difference between survival or not. So really, for the poorest kids, their families really need to be paid. It really needs to be a negative expected family contribution. And that's part of the reason even why the most qualified socioeconomically disadvantaged students who could get themselves into one of these places or do get themselves into one of these places, that they don't enroll because it's not a realistic understanding of what's involved for the family. And I'm not even talking about flying home. I tell the story that the researcher you're referring to is a wonderful scholar named Sarah Goldberg-Robb, and she's talking to the financial aid director at Amherst, who's laughing that one of the students didn't have the money to fly her family out for graduation and thought that was an expression of need. Well, which of us would miss our kids' college graduation?
And her point was that should be included, because
going home for vacations. Many schools close dining halls during breaks, so the kids who are on financial aid, dependent on living there, don't have access to food during breaks. I mean, it's just, and I think the debt forgiveness programs or the debt forbearance programs, data on this is overwhelming. It's not the amount of debt that drives whether students attend and stay in college. It's putting money in their pockets. Right. So I know, for example, with my students, I mean, it doesn't matter whether they come out of a year owing $5,000 or $7,000 or $8,000. That's just a balance sheet transaction. They need money to buy a Metro card. And you're just conceptualizing the problem in a different way. And now it becomes, look, if you want to say whether it's fair or not, it doesn't matter. If your goal is to get people into college and make them graduate, that's what needs to happen.
One thing that you said when we were talking right before this was that your audience is people who have gone, part of your target, a good part of your target audience is people who've gone to these schools to try to get them to see it this way. And what do you think would come of that?
Well, I'm very worried about the state of America, but I'm net optimistic about this conversation. In the book, I say, if you're not an elite, you're welcome here. I hope you share my outrage at a deck that's been stacked against you from the start. But this conversation, I do some version of this a lot. I'm sure you all, when you all ask questions, some of you will share where you've gone to college or work or where your kids go to college. And I'm pretty confident that you're going to have gone to schools like this. So it's a tough sell in some sense. I understand that I'm asking people to reconsider their alma maters as social actors, but I also think that I'm talking to people who, by virtue of their education, are consumers of data. And I think it's fair enough to say whether I've proved causation. I claim that on balance that elite colleges are actually detrimental to society. Maybe you'll resist that. But I think my book is irrefutable in this sense. I cannot imagine somebody reading my book and not thinking that these schools, given their overabundance of resources, have to do much more than they're doing.
And you would like them to?
So yeah, I don't think there's any magic bullet on this, and I think the solutions would look different in different places. I would like to see these schools commit to increasing socioeconomic diversity significantly. The Pell Grant is kind of an imperfect measure of need, but I'm good with whatever. You know, you said this earlier. I have this concept, Amartya Sen has this concept of the nidhi and the naya. When I teach this in ethics, I'm like, okay, you know, we have a flute. Should we give it to the best flute player? Should we give it to the person who made the flute? Should we give it to the person with the greatest appreciation for music, or should we give it to the richest person? Well, everybody knows it shouldn't go to the richest person. They have no claim on the flute. So instead of worrying about perfect justice, let's worry about injustice. And I know that the status quo is grossly unjust. Now, what do the solutions look like? Well, we know some things that don't work. We know that ALDC preferences create massive preferences for rich whites. We know that early admissions is a disaster. You know, I think that one story I say in the book is James Conant, the former president of Harvard. He was also the administrative director of the Manhattan Project. I feel confident that these schools, with their enormous human and financial capital, if they dedicated themselves to the goal of significantly increasing socioeconomic diversity, that they could do it. The solutions will look different in different places, but the mechanisms are there.
You know, I know that there's been an effort, I can't remember its name, but the president of Franklin Marshall assembled a coalition of colleges, of, you know, elite colleges.
Coalition of the willing.
Yeah, that need to increase socioeconomic diversity. And I think they even made commitments to numbers. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, it's not a whopper of a number. I mean, you know, I have to say I'm not interested in Harvard getting from 3% people from the lowest income quintile to 3.5. They're sitting on $50 billion. I think the pandemic proved that it's not a rainy day fund. It is not, you know, Clarence Thomas asks a question. He asked it in Grutter versus Bollinger, which is the previous Supreme Court case, which sets the precedent on race-based affirmative action. And he asked the university, he asked Michigan, what interest does the University of Michigan have in being the most elite law school? And as an educator, I don't only teach the smartest people. I teach anybody who comes through my door. And I think that's, I understand that Harvard and Yale or Princeton aren't going to do that, but they offer potential value to so many more people than they serve currently. And they have so much financial capacity to do much more that it just seems to me morally compelled to do it.
You know, one of your arguments, as you pointed out, is that the suburbs have kind of shaped themselves in part in response to the elite colleges, so that they, you know, provide, you know, they tax themselves to provide athletics and many AP classes, all of the things that the elite colleges look for. Do you see that would change if elite colleges became more committed to diversity?
Well, in a chicken and egg kind of way, I know that the suburbs won't change on their own. And I know that elite colleges could put pressure on them to do it. You know, one of the things I always, that most stuck with me from your book is Chris Christie's story that he feels that basically he was saved by his family having moved out of Newark to Livingston, New Jersey. And
Right when he was studying kindergarten.
right when he was starting kindergarten. And in some sense, he's probably right. And how disastrous, depressing the statement is that about America, to say that a young person's road to salvation is to move into an affluent community. There are ways to make borders more porous. Massachusetts has a program called METCO, which effectively buses kids from socioeconomically disadvantaged districts into more advantaged districts. And it's wonderful. They have great results. It's subsidized by the state. And I always do this exercise with my class where I'm like, okay, if I were plunked down on the planet and I was a single Black mother of an infant child, what would I do? And my strategy would be to get myself into the richest school district that I possibly could. I would be the poorest person in the most affluent district where I could afford a place. Now, one thing I love about Montclair is there actually is a diversity of housing. And people don't really think about this, but where we used to live, it was all single family houses and basically it cost $1 million. That was the cheapest way in. The only teensy bit of diversity came from a single housing project that had been zoned into our community because the neighboring community didn't want it. Having lots of different types of housing stock, apartments and affordable housing and multifamily houses are essential to preserving the economic diversity of the community. And nothing stops an elite college from saying, you know what, that's something that we value. In high schools where we recruit, we're particularly interested in communities that have made a meaningful commitment to economic diversity.
Interesting.
They have the power to say whatever they want. They're private actors with infinite resources. So let's hear them say something pro-social like that.
No, I don't know, are we at a time where we should start taking questions? Because I think it's around 7:40. So anyone who would like to ask a question, please.
So from my knowledge, the 8 Ivies have 59,000 students. The colleges I've taught at, A&M has more than that alone. Ohio State, 47,000 undergraduates, right? So you're putting an onus on these universities because they have infinite budgets and all that. But isn't this a bigger discussion of what this country wants as a policy? Elite universities in Europe are free. And you apply to them through your hard work, not because your father went there necessarily. I grew up in Romania where at 14, you were meant to have to take an exam, whether you're going to go to high school so you can go to university. I mean, there was many layers that you had to go through. And it was really, I must say, looking back into the 60s in Romania, that was a meritocracy, much more than it is here. So these are social decisions and policy decisions, right, that have to change. That I'm not sure Harvard asking a town whether they have minority student housing or something will change.
It's not a question.
Well, the question is this really achievable from that end, or is it achievable from a larger policy decision? We underfunded our university, right? I mean,
Well, we have an underfunded elite university.
well, because that's not through the government, essentially.
It is. Elite universities receive $20 billion a year collectively in tax advantages. I think it's very achievable. I mean, John Friedman addresses a version of the question that you just asked, which is, as a total percentage of even of college graduates, elites represent a small number. And certainly as a percentage of Americans, they represent an infinitesimal number. However, everybody on the Supreme Court went to one of these places. Everybody on the management committee at Goldman Sachs went to one of these places. Everybody at McKinsey and all of the management consultancies went to these places. Everybody on the masthead of the New York Times and the Washington Post went to these places. You know, I think it's also important to say that, you know, one of the pathways that Trump most successfully exploited on his march to the presidency was fomenting of antipathy for elites. You know, it's a page he took from Adolf Hitler's playbook. But part of the reason that that argument resonates is because it's at bottom true. And the elites, while they certainly cannot account for all of the inequity in higher education or all of the income inequality in America, have a massive untapped capacity, massive untapped potential to expand capacity. Would that be a complete solution to the problem? No, but you know, would it make a meaningful difference in a lot of people's lives? Sure.
Well, you also talked about colleges that really work to encourage their students to go into public service as opposed to Goldman Sachs. And I mean, there's results there. I mean, those schools, was it Reed?
Well, Reed is really admirable, but I tell the story of Bates. Their president, Clayton Spencer's Purposeful Work Initiative, and about 15% of Bates graduates go into teaching. I mean, I think that's a significant accomplishment. I'm sure some of them go into investment banking too, and that's fine. It just shouldn't be, the college shouldn't function principally as a factory of taking rich kids and making them investment bankers, which is the status quo.
Hi, I'm actually MIT graduate. So,
Yay.
The notion of, you know, you mentioned the fact that a lot of people in consulting, Goldman Sachs, etc., people who are leaders came out of these elite institutions. And I think one thing that's fair to ask is the whole notion of meritocracy. And we don't seem to be doing terribly well over the last 40, 50 years that these people do this. And I think you hit something about Trump. And there are people on the Democratic side as well. I mean, the notion now that you need a college degree to work in a bank that required a high school degree years ago, the cost of college right now, these people, I think something's deeply wrong with just the whole notion of college. Elite colleges, I think, are just a bill of goods for people sold, because I don't know, the Harry Truman, you know, I mean, somebody like Biden is almost an accident. He didn't go to Ryan school, but he seems perfectly capable. So can you address that notion of merit and what you see in that? I mean, is there something better about going to college?
Well, not better.
Being a careerist and being
Right.
absolutely wonderful.
Better for your economic prospects. I don't think it makes you a better human being. You know, I talk a lot in the book about the notion of meritocracy, and the first thing is that meritocracy isn't a concept that exists in the ether. It's an actively constructed ethos. And it would be one thing if Harvard and Yale and Stanford said, look, we're not profit maximizers exactly, but we're status aggrandizers. We're in competition with one another to be the first to get to $1 trillion. We're going to do whatever it takes to get there. And I don't think they would be worthy of our respect, but at least they would be telling an honest story. And then we would regard them like lots of corporations that really aren't do-gooders, but are just doing what they do. But that's not the story that they tell. The story that they tell is that they're admitting the best and the brightest. And I start in this book, I tell in the book, a freshman convocation where the Stanford president looks at everybody and says, Stanford's admissions office doesn't make mistakes. But meritocracy is a double-edged sword. Because if we tell the rich white kids at Harvard and Yale and Stanford that they're the hardest working and most deserving of their status, then by implication, we tell the CUNY students that they're less hardworking and less deserving of their status. And goodness gracious, what does it say about people who don't have the means to get a college degree at all?
Quick question, how would you compare the quality of undergraduate instruction at elite universities versus someplace like CUNY?
So I think that's a great question. And, you know, one aspect of it is, so I have a whole chapter about the US News and World Report rankings, the spoiler, I don't like it. I really think they're a really evil actor. There's nothing in the US News rankings that even remotely tries to assess teaching value added. And in fact, while there's tons of data in the US about the economic value of a degree, we really, and there's some effort at education value added, some of which you mentioned in the book with respect to like individual teachers who make a difference in a life. And Steve Levitt's research shows that even just exposure to one great teacher in your primary, secondary career can make a real difference. We don't have equivalent data at the college level. And this is my anecdotal sense. And when I was in law school, I taught Harvard students for 3 years, and I've basically one way or another found a way to keep myself in the classroom for my whole life. There's no difference. There's no reason to think that Ivies would be any better at it because they don't prize teaching. It's not a significant part of the tenure or promotion portfolio, and it's not structured in a way to really foster great teaching. I mean, the best teachers that I had, Michael Sandel, I had in a class with 900 people. Is that teaching? I guess. I mean, it's a type of performance. At CUNY, again, I can't back this up with evidence, but I don't know. I think you'll have a better experience teaching wise at CUNY. Now, of course, in any given class that I'm teaching, I might have 12 kids there who started out with under 900 on their SATs in the same room with people who got 1,300, 1,400, 1,500 on their SATs. And there's a massive disparity in preparation, which makes it very difficult from a pedagogical standpoint. But, our whole institution, I mean, not just my college, all of CUNY, I would even say all of public education is dedicated around excellence in teaching. So I just can't, I don't see any evidence for the proposition that elite colleges are actually better at educating, and every bit of common sense tells me that they're worse.
Okay, anybody else? This is your moment. You get to ask the question.
Why did you decide to write a book on this subject?
What was your? I know my answer. I'm just curious. What made you? When was the moment?
Questions for you.
No, I promise I'll answer. But
Well, I guess when I watched Oprah and saw Mark Zuckerberg and Cory Booker and Chris Christie announce this gift to transform the New York schools, and I had volunteered as as kind of a tutor in the New York schools, and I knew what just a gargantuan thing that promising to do in 5 years, and I had covered New York for the Washington Post over the years that I was bureau, and I just thought this would be one of the most interesting.
Right. I mean, it's great. They're great characters, right? I mean, I think you need, and also I think from a writer's standpoint, you live with a book for a very, very long time, and you really have to be very passionate about story and cause, and by the time you finish your book, you've read it so many times that it's kind of unbearable. I'll tell you very specifically what it was. I have a lifelong aversion to bullies, and I'm going to say this bluntly, but it's the truth. The story that rich white people tell about poor people of color is that they're lazy and stupid. And after I worked at CUNY for 20 years, I was like, wow, it's the flip. They work so much harder, and every element of the story, oh, they drink. No. It's the rich white kids who go out and drink. The poor kids don't have any money to buy alcohol. And so the story is the opposite. I understand. I talk about it a lot. I see that some people, it gets their dander up, but it's the truth. And and a lot of people really get it. And I have to say, when I talk to young people, including young college students, even college students at really, top schools, they totally get it. They understand that it's not a just system. But that's it. It's always I just have a lifelong aversion to bullies. I'll tell one other story briefly. I just remember sitting at Christmas and we had this cousin who is a greeting card magnate. Who knows how much money he was worth. And my dad would sit there and he would treat my dad like he was a piece of crap because he was a high school teacher. And I knew that my father was worth 1,000 of those people. And so that's kind of the story that I'm telling here is it's not that the people that I teach at CUNY, that they're not as smart or not as hardworking or not as deserving. In so many regards of how I measure human beings, they're better. And, you know, I just can't stand the story that they're less deserving.
Thank you, Evan. So actually, there are 25 people on our Zoom who are watching this at the same time. And one of them has an excellent question for you, which is how much resistance, if any, are you encountering as you try to get your important message out to media like the Wall Street Journal?
No, it's different in different I mean, you know, I have a very clear conception of how I'd like this to go, and I've gotten close in some regards. So there were chapters of the book. The Atlantic excerpt did a chapter of the book, and then Mother Jones just excerpted did a chapter of the book, which was framed around the Supreme Court case, and I've been able to publish a number of op-eds. And that's an important type of institutional support. And the editors of
Forbes, even Forbes did an interview with you.
even Forbes. And
I mean,
Happiness tool, right?
exactly. What more can we say than that?
so so that's a certain type of institutional support. At the same time, I have a good connection at the New Yorker, and I know they put it in front of them several times. And I think the best op-ed that I wrote, we ran on CNN. It's kind of about the tension in Harvard's position, which Clarence Thomas exposed. And the Times, you know, didn't take it, and they ran something else, which was from a right-wing standpoint. So I'm kind of interested. I know your question is more about human beings, but that type of sort of elite support is really, really important in making people feel like they have to reckon with this data. So I think it's important that the book be something that people have to have a position on. So it's been mixed, you know, it's like anything else. I'm sure Dale can testify to this. Anytime you put something out to the world, people just tell you about themselves. You know, some people are very, very nice and grateful. And, you know, my family members told me that there was some example in his family, a very complicated relationship, where actually one of his children didn't take their elite degree to make money. And I guess from their standpoint, that disproved my entire chapter 3. So, you know, everybody has their own reaction to it, but, you know, I can read the room. I see plenty of people nodding their heads. I know that they know that there's something to it.
Here's another good question from the folks online. Montclair may be diverse, but there are a good number of families in this town who are Ivy or bust. Why do you think there are not more of these types of frank conversations about the ways Ivies exacerbate inequality?
Well, I'm going to first say how grateful I am that question, that you're framing the question that way. And I think that we live in Montclair, that there's actually a place where that type of question can be asked. You know, I got involved with the campaign for the school bond, which I'm very grateful passed. And I got to see, you know, I think we're both fascinated by how local governments work and you know, people fetch in various ways, but I have to say this community is so wonderful to me because, you know, the most right-leaning person here is left and the most left-leaning person that I used to live with. And everybody here is pretty smart and receptive to data. I think the direct answer to your question, what's very complicated about this is that every parent wants the best for their child. And I'm always very careful to acknowledge that. And I think the distinction that people have to draw is wanting the best for their child, but also being willing to demand that the system operate justly, even if that's slightly to the indirect detriment of their kid. And that's the tension, is people are thinking about it from their own kid's standpoint, but my daughter is here tonight. My book starts with a joke. It says, for Maddie, sorry, and she gets jokes all the time. Well, there goes your chance of going to Harvard. I'll say this, boy, I don't care where she goes. I just want her to be happy. The kids that I teach at CUNY as human beings are so admirable and resilient and motivated by social justice. And I'm so proud to teach them. And if that's where she chooses to go, boy, that'll be spectacular by me. But, please have me over to please pick my book for your book club and I'll come and talk. I mean, this conversation happens 20 or 50 people at a time.